Nobody had ever seen it. Not once, not for a single second, in all the millions of summers people have stood on its beaches. A lake visited by millions of people every single year, photographed more than almost any body of water in the country, and its actual floor, the real bottom, had never been touched by a single working camera. Not until a small unmanned machine, built by hand, tested to the point of failure over and over again, was lowered into the water on a September morning and asked to do something no person could survive doing themselves. What it found down that did not match a single legend that had grown up around this lake for 100 years. And that, it turns out, is the real story. Lake Tahoe sits high in the Sierra Nevada, straddling the line between California and Nevada, held in a basin that faulting and glacier spent millions of years carving out of granite. From the shore, it looks like almost every other alpine lake, a sheet of blue ringed by pine trees and ski runs. That impression does not survive contact with the numbers. At its deepest measure point, the floor of Lake Tahoe sits about 1,645 feet below the surface, which makes it the second deepest lake in the entire United States, behind only Crater Lake in Oregon. Picture the Empire State Building, all 1,454 feet of it, lowered straight down into the water. The antenna at the very top would still be sitting under nearly 200 feet of lake. The Eiffel Tower would disappear with room to spare. All told, Tahoe holds something like 39 trillion gallons of water, enough that if you drained it out flat across the entire state of California, it would leave the whole state under more than a foot of water. It is not a lake in the casual sense of the word. It behaves more like a small enclosed sea, with its own internal weather, its own currents, and, somewhere below the reach of sunlight, its own crushing, permanent night. That depth is exactly why the legend took root in the first place. Stories about Tahoe having no bottom at all, that its center connect to some hidden channel running out to other lakes or even the ocean, have circulated for as long as people have lived around it. A darker version of the story insists that the cold has turned the lake into something like a preservation chamber, that bodies sink down there and simply never decompose, that they sit upright on the floor in the dark, fully intact, for decades at a time. And the version of that story that gets repeated most often attaches itself to one of the most famous names in the history of undersea exploration, claiming that the legendary French oceanographer Jacques Cousteau once descended into Tahoe's deepest water and came back up pale and unwilling to describe what he had seen, offering only a single ominous line about the world not being ready for it. It is a compelling story, and it is worth saying plainly that no verified recording, transcript, or dated account of Cousteau ever saying anything like that has ever surfaced. There is no confirmed record that he dug the deepest part of Lake Tahoe at all, and people connected to his expeditions have pushed back on the story for years. A great line does not need a source to spread. It only needs to be repeated enough times that nobody thinks to ask where it came from. But underneath that specific, unverifiable legend sits something that is entirely real, and it is a reason the ghost story ever felt believable. Below roughly 300 feet, Tahoe stops behaving like a normal lake. The seasons stop reaching it. While the surface warms in summer and cools in winter the way any lake does, the deep water holds at a nearly constant temperature all year long, hovering just above 39 degrees Fahrenheit, which happens to be the point at which fresh water reaches its maximum density and sinks to stay. It does not warm in July. It does not freeze in January. Past around 700 feet, sunlight is gone entirely, not dim, just absent, and any camera down there sees nothing until it switches on its own lights. In water that cold, that still, and that starved of oxygen, decomposition really does slow to a crawl compared to what happens in a warm, oxygen-rich environment. That single true fact, cold water resists decay, is a seed the entire mythology grew from. It just grew a great deal further than the evidence ever supported. For most of Tahoe's history, nobody could check. Diving to real depth is dangerous everywhere, and Tahoe stacks its hazards in an unusual way. The floor of its deepest basin lies well past the point where recreational scuba diving becomes lethal, since most divers have no business operating past about 130 feet before nitrogen starts acting on the brain like a slow anesthetic. Layer on to that the near-freezing cold, which pulls heat out of an unprotected body with brutal efficiency, and then add something people rarely think about, which is altitude. Tahoe's surface sits above 6,200 feet in elevation, and at that altitude the physics behind every dive table shifts, narrowing the margin for error even before a diver gets in the water. Depth? cold, and altitude combined to make the true bottom of this lake one of the least accessible places in the country. So for generations, the floor of Tahoe stayed exactly where every legend needed it to stay, out of reach, unfalsifiable, available for anyone to fill in with whatever story they liked, because nobody could go down and prove them wrong. That changed in September of 2025. A non-profit called Restoring the Lake Depths Foundation, working with the Tahoe Fund and support from the Marty's Camp Foundation, spent years developing a purpose-built remotely operated vehicle nicknamed Deep Emerald, RME to the small team that built her. She was engineered to survive 50 atmospheres of pressure, carried a fiber optic tether roughly 600 meters long, close to 2,000 feet, and was fitted with 8 thrusters and a 4K camera powerful enough to work in water that has never once seen a photon of natural sunlight. Getting there took more than 20 test dives, and by the team's own account, the testing did not get easier as they went. Equipment came back cracked, leaking, and beat up more often than it came back clean. On the day of the actual descent, the team lowered Emmy into the water almost at the center of the lake, just south of Tahoe City, near one of the deepest points around the entire basin, and live-streamed the whole thing publicly so that anyone could watch in real time. Sudeep Chandra, a limnology professor involved with the project, and other members of the team narrated as the vehicle sank past the point where light disappears, past the boundary where the temperature locks into its permanent, unmoving cold, and down toward a floor that had never had a single working camera pointed at it before. The vehicle reached a depth of roughly 1,570 to 1,600 feet, closer to the true bottom of Lake Tahoe than any machine or diver in recorded history. And what its lights found, once the silt settled and the camera steadied, was almost aggressively ordinary. The water at that depth looked barren and silty. There were no fish, no aquatic plants, none of the greenery that fills the shallower, sunlit parts of the lake. What the cameras did pick up were fine sediment patterns scattered across the floor that researchers on the live stream described as looking almost like a starfield, along with material drifting just above the lake bed itself, organic matter that had washed in from the stream feeding the lake over who knows how many years and settled slowly to the bottom. There was no Tahoe Tessie, the lake's own homegrown answer to a Loch Ness-style monster. There were no mob victims standing at attention in the dark. There was cold water, fine silt, and quiet. The team estimated Emmy covered somewhere between 400 and 500 meters across the lake bed during her roughly 12 minutes down there, and by every account from the people who watched it happen live, the bottom of Lake Tahoe simply looked like the floor of a very deep, very cold, very clean lake. That is not the end of the story, though, because Tahoe has produced 2 other genuinely strange, thoroughly documented findings over the years, and both of them are more interesting than anything the ghost stories invented. The first involves trees. Not at 1,000 feet down, and not scattered across the deep basin, but standing in shallow water close to the south shore, near the mouth of Taylor Creek, first noticed back in 1931 when a severe drought pulled the lake's surface down low enough to expose them. A researcher named Samuel Harding studied a cluster of well-rooted stumps there and pulled radiocarbon samples that, once corrected with modern dating methods, came back at somewhere between roughly 4,800 and 5,500 years old. Similar drowned stumps have since turned up at other spots around the lake and in nearby Fallen Leaf Lake, some of them 7 feet tall, some carbon-dated even older, with one nearby cluster stretching back more than 6,000 years. For a conifer to grow at all, it needs to be rooted in dry ground, breathing open air. That means that thousands of years ago, during a stretch of climate scientists now describe as a mid-Holocene megadrought, Tahoe's water level must have dropped well below its natural rim and stayed there for a very long time, long enough for forests to take root on ground that sits underwater today. When the drought finally broke and the wetter climate of the last several thousand years took hold, the water rose back up over those trees in the same cold, low-oxygen conditions that fed every corpse legend did something it could actually be credited for. It kept the wood from rotting away. It is a real and still slightly mysterious phenomenon, drought recorded not in a tree ring chart in some archive, but in trunks still rooted exactly where they grew, quietly holding their shape underwater for thousands of years. Researchers studying similar stumps in nearby Fallen Leaf Lake, at depths closer to 100 feet, have even debated whether some of the trees actually grew in place or slid down from steep slopes above during past seismic activity, which shows this is still active, unsettled science rather than a closed case. The second real finding is less romantic and, in its own way, far more unsettling than any myth about the dead. Beginning in 2021, a scuba diver and filmmaker named Colin West founded a non-profit called Clean Up the Lake after a friend told him about pulling 600 pounds of trash out of Tahoe's eastern shore. That conversation turned into a full year-long mission to dive the lake's entire 72 miles of shoreline, working down to around 75 feet, close to the practical limit for most divers at this altitude. By the time the project wrapped in 2022, the team had logged more than 24,000 individual pieces of litter, adding up to over 25,000 pounds of trash pulled from underneath the surface of one of the clearest lakes in the country. Most of it was ordinary, aluminum cans by the thousands, plastic bottles, more than 280 pairs of sunglasses. Some of it was stranger. Engagement rings, vintage Nikon film cameras from the 1980s, an old Walkman with cassettes still loaded inside, cordless phones from the 90s, chunks of broken-down boats, even entire lampposts. The organization went on to run deep a survey dive between 35 and 55 feet at known litter hotspots, pulling up nearly 2,000 additional pounds and estimating, based on how consistent the density of trash was across those test zones, that as much as 17 to 29,000 pounds of litter could still be sitting in the deeper, less accessible parts of the lake, waiting for a future cleanup to reach it. None of these divers were hunting for bodies. They were doing patient, unglamorous environmental work. But it is worth sitting with the fact that the actual documented mystery lurking beneath Tahoe's surface for the last century wasn't a hidden graveyard. It was us. So here's where all three threads land. The true floor of Lake Tahoe has now, for the first time in its entire history, actually been seen by a working camera, and it turned out to be silty, dark, cold, and empty of anything resembling a monster or a mafia victim. The lake's genuinely strange and scientifically documented mystery is a set of ancient tree stumps near its shallower shoreline, rooted in place thousands of years before any legend about Tahoe existed, evidence of a drought severe enough to lower the entire lake below its natural rim for centuries. And the closest thing this lake has to a real, provable secret hiding just beneath its famously clear surface is tens of thousands of pounds of litter, dropped in by ordinary people on ordinary summer days, sitting there for decades because nobody had bothered, or been able, to go down and get it. The famous quote attributed to Jacques Cousteau still has no confirmed source, no tape, no transcript, nothing beyond the fact that it makes for a great campfire line. The refrigerator effect, the real physics behind why cold water slows decay, is genuine. It just did not build the corpse gallery the legends promised. It built a time capsule of drought-era trees, and unfortunately, it built a time capsule of our own garbage too. None of that makes Lake Tahoe less remarkable. If anything, it makes it more so. A basin that deep, that cold, and that clear did not need an invented monster to be worth talking about. It had a genuine unsolved climate mystery sitting quietly near its shoreline the entire time, and it had an entirely different kind of ghost waiting in its depths, one made of aluminum and glass instead of bone. The machines that finally went down there were not looking for horror. They were looking for the truth, whatever shape it took, and it turned out the truth was both stranger and far more ordinary than the stories anyone had been telling. So tell me what you think down in the comments. Did you grow up hearing that Lake Tahoe was bottomless, or that its cold black water was hiding bodies nobody could ever recover? And now that we finally have real footage of what's actually down there, silt, ancient trees, and decades of our own trash, what do you think should happen next? More cleanup dives, more scientific exploration, or both? Let me know below. And if you want to keep following the places most people will never get to see for themselves, subscribe, because there's always another depth worth looking into.